Hello and welcome everyone to our latest version of Sociocracy 101, a, uh, a webinar on how you can be incorporating sociocracy into your projects and why you might want to. And we are recording the presentation tonight, and we've got a number of people who are planning on watching the recording. And then we will make that available as soon as we can. And we also have another presentation that we'll be doing next week. But just to get us started, there are many different flavors of sociocracy out there, and they have a lot of similarity, and a lot of their differences are kind of minor and more stylistic. And so I'm going to be talking about Sociocracy 3.0, which is my preferred flavor of sociocracy. But the core elements of what we're going to be talking about apply to all of the different forms of sociocracy. So even if you're working with an organization that has adopted a slightly different flavor, this will still make sense. And I think that one of the important things to remember from the start is sociocracy hasn't really invented anything. We'll talk about this a little bit later on in terms of sociocracy as a pattern language, but all sociocracy is attempting to do is pull together the practices and the principles that consistently are more effective in helping groups work collaboratively. So in some ways, you already know everything you need to know about sociocracy just from your own experience, from leaning into the things that work consistently and avoiding the things that don't work. You're going to invent for yourself something like sociocracy. And so as we're talking through it, this is really just pulling together these tools in a convenient kit so that it's easier to figure out how to apply them. And likewise, the core tenet of sociocracy is that you really have to design it to fit your local needs, your local group, and the culture that you're developing. So no matter where you start, no matter what flavor of sociocracy you start with, using the tools eventually means that you will evolve your own form that will be unique to your local group. So who is this presentation for? It is for lifeboat builders, people who are trying to figure out what we can be doing together to increase our individual and collective resilience in the face of climate change and the social pressure that that is putting on all of our systems. And people who are figuring out how can we work together more effectively to build our resilience and to have a positive impact in our local communities and in the world in general. So the goal really of applying sociocracy is hopefully increased resilience. One of the great things about sociocracy is it's adaptive. So even as things change, the practices of sociocracy are going to allow you to navigate those changes more effectively. It also allows us to maximize our collective learning, both by bringing together what we already know and also by giving us the tools that we can learn through experimentation and figure out what actually is working currently. It also allows us to build deeper relationships with each other, relationships that are really grounded in our deep why of why we're doing this work together, and allowing people to show up as they are, warts and all, in a way where we can still manage to work well with each other. And ultimately, the most important thing is increased effectiveness. How does this actually make a difference on the ground, being able to move closer to our goals and to be able to navigate whatever challenges are coming our way? So I like to start with kind of the big picture of why we need sociocracy. And one of my favorite parables is the blind ones and the elephant. And does anyone know the story of the blind ones and the elephant? Are you familiar with that? Yep. So The short form of the blind ones and the elephant is there were blind people who had never seen an elephant before, and one day an elephant came to the village, and they were all ushered up to the elephant and given a chance to explore it. And of course, because they had no sight, they were doing it with their hands. And they all grabbed a different part of the elephant. One grabbed the tusk, one grabbed the ears, one grabbed the tail, etc. And they instantly started fighting. The one with the tusk said, "Well, this is nothing more than a spear." And the one with the ear said, "Well, this is nothing more than a leaf." And the one holding the tail said, "Well, this is just a piece of rope." And this is the situation that we often find ourselves in. We each have a particular perspective. We're touching into something that is larger than that one piece, and we get a little distracted about our particular version of it. And so the moral of the story is none of us can see the whole big picture, and all of us are holding a relevant part. And what we need to do, and what sociocracy allows us to do, is to figure out ways of combining our pieces and parts together so that we get a better picture of the whole. And so what we're going to cover today, we're going to go through a little bit of the history just so you know where this is coming from. And then we'll talk about the core concept behind sociocracy, the principles that act as the foundation for sociocracy, and then some of the tools and techniques and processes that allow you to implement it, to actually use it on the ground in your groups. And then at the end, we'll go over a couple tools and ideas that are useful, kind of the miscellaneous other category. As we're going through, if you have any questions, just type them into the comments, and we can either, if they're appropriate in the moment, we'll pause and answer the question, or if not, we'll have questions that we can come back to at the end. And I'm hoping to go through the basics quickly and make more space at the end for any questions that we might have. So, context and history. Lots of people are just hearing about sociocracy now, but it actually has a very long history. The sort of what we would call the core part of sociocracy was put together by Gerald Endenburg, who is in the Netherlands, and that was done in the 70s. And the company Endenburg Electric that he pioneered sociocracy with is still using sociocracy, is still in business, and employs something like 100 people in the firm. So this is a system that has real world application. It's been used in nonprofits, for-profits, healthcare, education, all sorts of different venues, including, I just read recently, there is an oil company in Russia that uses sociocracy, which that is a incredible feat of cultural engineering to be able to pull that off. So this system of sociocracy has been around for over 50 years. And even before that, there were some deep roots in Quaker meeting practices and in some face-to-face democracy tools that have been around for almost 100 years. And more recently, this is where some of the flavors of sociocracy have started to develop. Holacracy was developed as a way to make it more appealing to for-profits and large corporations. There's also Sociocracy for All, which is a kind of North American version of it. And the form that I like is Sociocracy 3.0, which has been around for almost 10 years now, which also incorporates elements of agile project management along with the kind of core tools of sociocracy. So some of the things that are appealing about sociocracy, and especially Sociocracy 3.0, first and foremost, think about sociocracy as a toolkit. So it's very flexible, it's very adaptable, it's not a one size fits all. And so there are the way that it can morph to meet your needs, and that's actually how it's designed. It's really a kit of tools with some principles and some understanding about when and how those tools make sense to apply. It also, Sociocracy 3.0 is licensed on the Creative Commons. It's incredibly free, entirely free, and they encourage adaptation as well. So you can start with the treasure trove of materials that they have available online and then adapt them to meet your needs. As I said at the very beginning, it's also what's known as a pattern language. And what that means basically is rather than trying to invent some sort of new system, what Sociocracy has done over the years has said, well, let's look at groups that are collaborating well and notice what they're doing and what they seem to have in common. And then taking those tools and evolving them and adapting them to see how they can work together. So, as I said, these are often things, the language may be unusual, the language may be something that you need to come up to speed on. But once you start to experience how this works, there should be some resonance with how things have worked well in groups that you've been a part of. And likewise, I actually encourage when I do a lot of consulting work with groups, and one of the first exercises I do is I have people think about when you've worked in teams that have worked well, when you've worked on projects that have worked really well, think about what it was that those experiences had in common and draw out your own lessons from them. And when you do that, pretty much what you're going to invent is something that looks a lot like Sociocracy. So that gives you a little bit of kind of the background of where it's coming from, but really at the heart of Sociocracy is this experimental principle. So the core of this is we're going to treat everything that we do as a series of experiments designed to improve our effectiveness. So we're going to do more of what works and we're going to do less of what doesn't. And that's pretty much it. If you follow that rule as you evolve your organization, you're going to find greater and greater effectiveness. And the reason we do this is because the reality is that most of the decisions that we make are not actually decisions. They are habitual, we do what we've always done because that's how we've always done it. And in some ways, our brains are set up to do this because from an evolutionary standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. It actually takes a lot of energy to think critically and make a clear decision about things. And going with the habit, going with the flow is just an easier way of working. And in the short term, it's usually quite efficient. You don't have to spend a lot of energy to get to the decision. And if you are living and working in a stable environment, generally those decisions continue to fit. So they're very effective. The downside is we know from science and experience that a lot of the way we think through things are subject to biases and heuristics, that we don't actually see things in an accurate and clear way. And a lot of times our decisions reflect that. And most importantly, in the situation that we all find ourselves in globally, this is a really bad way of working when you are in changing environments. When the decisions that used to make sense in the past are no longer applied in the same situation. And, bottom line is if you always do what you've always done, you're always going to get what you got. And we find ourselves in a world where I don't know about you, but I don't want to get more of what we got. So we're trying to find ways of avoiding those pitfalls of the business as usual world, avoiding the pitfalls of a lot of the projects and groups that we've probably been a part of with top-down decision-making, unrecognized tensions and conflicts, unresolved conflicts. and we want to find a way that it actually feels like we're moving towards the goals that we want to be moving towards. So we put that all together and we have our core concept of treating all of our decisions as a series of experiments. And one of the things that this means is that uh, even when things don't go according to plan, which they often don't, we're still getting a lot of valuable information out of it. We're still setting ourselves up so that even when things don't go the way that we hoped, we are still coming off better because we're learning from it and we're doing it in a way that we can apply that moving forward. So what is an experiment? Bernhard Brockel-Brent, who is one of the co-founders of Sociocracy 3.0, boils it down to try something that you think will work and do it in a way where you can tell if it's working or not. And it's really the second point that is the key here. Our kind of traditional way, habitual way of working is the Einsteinian principle of insanity. We keep doing the same thing and expecting different results. But what we want to do is we want to set our projects up in a way that we can actually see if we're on track or if we might be getting off track. So the way some of the advantages of working this way is when you break things down into experiments, basically your risks go down because you're not trying to make forever decisions. You're trying to make decisions that are good enough for now, safe enough to try. And it encourages you when you're setting up your experiment, we shorthand it as aim, act, reflect, repeat as necessary. So when you're setting up your experiment, and we'll go through this in more detail, but you're going to draw from the best of your experience so far. What do you know? What works? What seems promising? You're going to make a game plan. So I think if we do X, we'll get Y. And then you're going to do it and you're going to monitor and track how that's going. So that you can reflect, you can check in periodically and make sure that you're on track and that you can course correct more quickly if you aren't on track, and you can grow on the things that are working. So what this means is that we're reality testing our process in small incremental ways rather than, for example, coming up with your perfect imagined 5-year plan where you invest a whole lot of effort into this long-term series of actions only to discover that you've invested a lot on something that's just not going to work. So we're going to treat everything as an experiment, but that means we also need to make sure that we have some ground on which we can operate. And the principles in sociocracy create that foundation. So we have a solid container in which those experiments can happen so that the experiments don't sort of wander off and leave us kind of wondering where we are in the woods. And there are two sets of principles that we're going to talk about. The first are what I call the grounding principles. And these are really the sort of basic requirements that you need for sociocracy to work in your group. You need to have everyone signing on to these basic principles or else it's not going to work. And then there are 10 organizing principles, which allow us, once we have that foundation, they give us the tools for being able to evolve and move in a towards our goals in an effective way. So these are the 7 grounding principles of sociocracy, and really the core are equivalence and consent. I really feel like this is the heart of the principles. And equivalence is a recognition that people who are affected by a decision should have some role in shaping those decisions. And that the consent part of it is no one should have an agreement or a decision forced on them that is going to cause them undue hardship that they can't live with. And this, in some sense, sounds like it should be kind of a moral position. It sounds like good ethics, but it's also immensely practical. Because if people are affected by a decision and they're not included in the decision-making process, pretty much you just guaranteed you're going to discover something after the decision has been made that's going to cause problems. So by engaging people early who are affected by decisions early on in that process, you're just creating a more efficient way of making sure that the right information is being considered in that decision-making process. Similarly with consent, if the people who are being affected by a decision can't live with that decision, at the very least, they are not going to actively engage with and work towards that decision. And what's likely to happen is that they're going to do everything that they can to undermine that decision. So just from an effectiveness standpoint, equivalence and consent are kind of the ground that we want to stand on. We want to make sure that we are including people who are affected by the decision in the process in a way where their concerns are considered. To make that work, then we also need accountability. So if we're going to go through the trouble of making sure that people are included in decisions and the agreements that come out of it, then we need people to be accountable to those agreements. So once the decision is made, people need to stick to the agreement. And accountability becomes a sort of the third leg on that stool of the core of what we need for this to work. The transparency then is similar. You can't really do any of this if information isn't readily available. If you don't know what information needs to be considered in making those decisions, and if people aren't sharing transparently their perspectives on those decisions. So the equivalence and consent are kind of the core, and then accountability and transparency are the supports that allow those decisions to actually move forward. And then continuous improvement, effectiveness, and empiricism are all the elements that go together to allow us to actually create the experimental process. Continuous improvement means that we're looking to iterate. We're not looking for once and done. We're okay starting with something that is good enough, not necessarily perfect. Empiricism means that we're keeping our decisions grounded on things that we can touch, talk about, relate to, as opposed to a lot of the challenges in many groups are that we get into a lot of esoteric, abstract, and ideological debates that don't really don't live in the room. So sociocracy reminds us to come back to what does that look like here in the room? And then effectiveness is also just a reminder that in doing these experiments, we're looking to have a positive impact. So we're prioritizing and picking the experiments that are actually going to keep us moving forward on those important goals. So those are the 7 principles that kind of create your foundation. And then there are 10 organizing principles that help us move towards the goals. And I really like the way that this graphic works, because we've got purpose and strategy right at the heart, right in the center, like the bullseye. And then around the outside, we have basically culture, learning, and mental models or shared understandings that create the container that hold this all together. So really the way they talk about it in Sociocracy 3.0 is we have 2 principles for orientation. How do we know that we're aligned and all moving in the same direction? The first is making sure that we are clear on the purpose, our why. And in Sociocracy, we are always coming back to our why. We recognize that the why is always morphing, it's always changing a little bit. This isn't something you just write down and engrave on a plaque. This is actually a why that is evolving as our understanding is evolving. And then we develop a strategy where we say, how do we get from where we are to where we need to be? what are the steps that we need to take to get from here to there. Once we have that orientation, then we need to figure out how do we navigate the hurly-burly of everyday work. So there are three principles here that help us keep moving through the choppy waters of trying to figure out how to get from here to there. And the first is they say focus on value. In Sociocracy 3.0, I redefine this as a focus on return on effort. For some people might know this as the Pareto principle or the 80-20 rule, but pretty consistently we get most of the bang out of some of the core, the first stuff that we focus on, the 20 that gets us 80. And we can waste a lot of effort trying to refine that last 20%, gilding the lily, trying to get things to be just perfect. So we really want to make sure that we're focused on the stuff that's really moving us forward and not getting distracted onto the things that just don't matter at that much. Again, I can't emphasize enough, we do everything by running experiments. This gives us short-term goals. It makes it, we can stay focused on what we need to be doing now in a way, again, where we're constantly reality testing, and it's bringing us back to either we're on track and we can keep going, or if we're off track, we know to do course corrections. And then sensing and responding, this is the reflection part. This is when you're running the experiments, remembering to pause from time to time to ask yourself if you're on course or not. So once we use the principles for orientation or for navigation to help us make decisions about what we're doing on our day-to-day. And then the next level out is we think about how we structure that work. So what is that kind of container that we want in our organization that helps us move forward and not step on each other's toes? And here there are two principles that are very much a balancing act. And in everything that we do in the Lifeboat Academy, we really emphasize the both and of things. And this is one of the core both ands. We want to figure out how we can enable people to innovate, to have agency, to be creative, to take the initiative. But we want to do so in a way that we minimize the oopses, that we make sure that people aren't working at cross purposes, that they aren't stepping on each other's feet in what they're doing. So when we're setting up our structures for the organization, and this is the idea of circles, the kind of the core of the sociocracy principle is we are creating enough coherence, enough separation that we're enabling people to have autonomy and the resources that they need to put that autonomy into place, but we're doing it in a way where we're recognizing interdependencies. So we're recognizing where our work overlaps or intersects, and making sure that we have good communication where that happens. And then finally, the three principles for transformation. This is a different way of working in that we come from a culture that is very top-down, command control, and this is not. This is a peer-to-peer system, a collaborative system, and one that is built for evolution. It's built to change. So we need to have a strong container to hold even the structure of our organization needs to be held into a stronger culture that can actually animate the process that we're talking about. We do this by taking the time to really understand each other's mental models. We all use the same word in slightly different ways, and we all see the world from slightly different perspectives. So we need to take the time to as best we can, make the space to understand where everyone's coming from. We need to take the time to talk about how we want to work with each other. What are the values? What are the principles that how are we going to put them in place in the work that we're doing? And we also all need to be committing both individually and as an organization to learning as we go. And that means identifying our own growth edge. Everyone is going to have it, every organization and every individual is going to have a growth edge. But that growth edge means stepping out of the comfort zone into some discomfort of addressing and learning the areas where you have some growing to do, but not going so far as to step into the freak out zone. So figuring out ways, that's the figuring out ways in the culture where you can be held in that discomfort, where there's space to be learning, experimenting, and making mistakes so that you can actually be maximizing your learning and the learning of the organization. So, so far we've been talking at a very high level about principles, but this does turn into a very practical process. And as I said before, the core of it is aim, act, reflect, repeat as necessary. So this cycle is, it's fractal. You can engage in this cycle at a very, day-to-day level. You can also engage in this cycle at a kind of strategy level, thinking about a multiple year plan and how you're going to work to accomplish your goals. And you can enter this cycle at any step. You don't have to always start in the same place. And in fact, usually circumstances are going to call your attention to one of these places in the cycle. But no matter where you start, there's a natural progression. Usually, we are starting with identifying tensions, often because tensions are going to present themselves whether we want them to or not. So starting with the tensions by creating a space where the tensions can come up, we can start the process of the aim, act, reflect cycle. One of the things that I quite like about sociocracy is that it normalizes tensions. Tensions are not seen as a problem. It's nothing to be afraid of. Tensions are simply a gap between our expectations and our experience. And as that gap between those two things, they are rich with information. And so really, it's meant to call our attention to this area where we can be a little bit more intentional about how do we close that gap between how we want things to work and how they're actually working. So, and the thing with tensions is they are felt. There are ways that we can create space intellectually to talk about tensions, but we feel tensions. We feel it as either an excitement about the possibility that things could be more like we expect them to be, or frustration that things aren't going the way we want them to. So they're going to come up one way or the other. Once we've identified and given a space to the tension, then what we're going to do is explore the drivers underneath the tension. So an easy way of thinking about this is the tension is like the flashing light on the dashboard. That's not the problem. It's just there to get your attention. What it's getting your attention for, though, is to point to what's going on under the surface. And those are what we call the drivers. And then the drivers are the animating forces that are at play. And one of the most important things to remember is drivers usually come in sets, in pairs. We've already talked about one, autonomy versus coordination. There is always going to be a tension where you can't just allow 100% autonomy. That's herding cats. That's a recipe for disaster. Likewise, you can't have 100% control, even though some people want to, some people think that's a good idea. 100% control means you've completely killed the organization, the life in the organization. 100% autonomy means there's no organization to have a life. So most drivers are like this. It's a both and. And what we are trying to understand is the balance point where we can, the kind of healthy, thriving middle. Um, Once we've identified those drivers, then the question is, so what? So how do we start working with those drivers to move more towards what we are hoping for? And I'm not going to go into too much detail about the developmental, the proposal process. It's laid out in Sociocracy, and you can follow a nice, I think it's like a 13-step process. The key here is to not start with a solution, but to actually take the time to explore the concerns. We call it gathering considerations at the Lifeboat Academy. So taking the time to talk to all the people who may be affected by that decision and get their perspective on it before generating a proposal. One of the most common problems that organizations have is one person or one group will come up with the solution without actually talking to the people who might be affected by it. And then once somebody has a solution on the table, there's a kind of a vested interest in trying to, you know, promote that and kind of force it through. So in the proposal process, what we're really doing is we're allowing diverse perspectives to bubble up and for a proposal to be generated that addresses as many of those concerns as possible. Once you considered taken in all of those considerations, you come up with an actual proposal, who's going to do what, and what's required to make that happen. And that's where we go through the consent process of exploring those proposals to make an agreement. And we do that with consent. That means that we are actively seeking out objections. So we're not trying to get to an agreement as quickly as possible. We're making sure that we are taking the time. It's go slow to go fast. We're taking the time that we need to take to make a good decision. And we're balancing both, and we're also not over laboring it. We're also not, trying to get to a perfect decision. We're trying to get to one that is good enough for now, safe enough to try. And some language that is very useful from Sociocracy is the difference between a consideration, a concern, and an objection. Basically, an objection is, I can't live with this. This is not good enough. It's not safe enough. There's going to be a problem if we move forward this way. A concern, on the other hand, is I'm worried that this might happen. I'm not sure that that's going to happen. This wouldn't be my preference. So being able to register your concerns and your objections and to have criteria or be able to differentiate those is really useful as when you're considering proposals. And the one other thing too about that is concerns are not it's concerns aren't tangential. They're still taken seriously, and you record your concerns because concerns are probably highlighting something that you want to be monitoring as you move forward with the proposal. So you want to make sure that they're recorded and that you're paying attention to them and accounting for them as you move forward. Once you have consent, once there is an agreement and everyone says, I can live with this is good enough for now, safe enough to try. Oh, actually, the other thing too about proposals and the experimental model is everything has a time limit, right? So we're never making perpetual agreements forever and ever. We are making agreements for a certain period of time. And we are making agreements for the amount of time that it's reasonable for that agreement to exist. And we know we're going to come back to it at some point and reevaluate whether or not those agreements continue to make sense. So when you make the agreement, that's actually one of the things that you're going to include. When are we going to come back and look at this agreement and revisit it? Oh, and definitely, it's really important to write down those agreements, have them in writing, and come back to them. And one of the things from experience that is it's so there's such a strong desire to kind of just move into action and to not really document things. And and then when you get into action, things continue to evolve, things happen. And then you come back to the agreement, and I'm going to say 9 times out of 10, it might be more like 10 times out of 10, you come back to the agreement and go, oh, right, that's what we were going to do. And sometimes, you've forgotten something, you've forgotten to do something that was in the plan from the start that you didn't do, and that came back and bit you in the ass. And sometimes there are parts to it that were like kind of faded away and weren't that necessary. So anyhow, that when you're making your agreements, it's really important to write it down, and it's really important to come back to them periodically, to revisit them and to move forward on the next step. So that's pretty much the core, really. That aim, act, reflect cycle of identifying tensions, exploring drivers, developing proposals by gathering considerations, using a consent process where you're seeking out objections and refining the proposal based on those objections, and then reaching an agreement that then you put into practice with a closing that loop where you are then going to come back and look at, when you're identifying tensions, that's the same as reflection or a retrospective. So that loop, in a fractal way, where it can be a daily thing, it can be a monthly thing, it can be seasonal, it can be yearly. That's your core process that basically will keep everything else moving forward well. There are a couple sort of miscellaneous concepts here that are also useful. Just again, to have kind of a language and a lens that allows us to have these conversations. One is the difference between governance and operations. And I would go even further and say there's also a difference between chores and projects that are kind of parallel here. So governance are conversations at a higher level. They're, how do we want to work together? What, nominally, where are we trying to get to together? How do we want to work with each other? Those are important, but different from operational questions. Who's going to do what by when? Who's going to take the garbage out? How are we going to make sure that the lights stay on? Being able to have the language and an understanding of how those two things relate can be really helpful. A lot of conflict in organizations comes from the fact that some people are talking operations and some people are talking governance at the same time. And I would recommend you don't separate out governance. This is core to sociocracy. You don't have a board of directors who, in the classic Carver model, the board of directors are the ones who are responsible for governance, and the employees are the ones who are responsible for operation, and never the two shall meet. In sociocracy, we are all responsible for both. And so it becomes really important for us to be able to talk about when we are switching from governance to operations. Likewise, within the operations realm, it's important, it's useful, I think, to be able to separate out chores from projects. And chores are ongoing, repeating responsibilities, getting the newsletter out, paying the bills, weeding the garden. They're the things that have to get done to move things forward. When you're talking about chores, you're looking at efficiency. You want to figure out, how do we get this done the easiest way possible that still works. Projects, on the other hand, are work that is going to make it easier for you to get the chores done. So projects are things that establish infrastructure, and that can be physical or it can be intellectual. So projects are ways of doing something better. And when you're doing projects, you're thinking about effectiveness, not necessarily efficiency. And projects are going to require, again, a different lens. They're both important. But having that language can be really useful. So another concept that's really important is delegation, and it's delegation from the whole. So ultimately, all of us are responsible for what's happening. The collective is the ultimate authority and the ultimate responsibility. We then delegate out that the some tasks within that whole to subagents who can take on that responsibility. But with delegation, think about an enlightened supervisor. It is ultimately the supervisor's responsibility to make sure that the delegate is getting the work done and that they're getting it done right and that they're getting the resources they need to be able to do it. So it's not like once you delegate things, you forget about them and they go away. You're always coming back to the whole to make sure that the work that's been delegated is getting done and has what it needs to be able to do the work. There's also this is not a sociocracy concept, but I find it really valuable. It's called developmental delegation. And that is the idea that you help people grow, you help their learning process by giving them more responsibility, by delegating some things to them and letting them do it. And it also means that you're not just handing it to them and walking away, but you're doing it by providing some oversight, some mentoring, some coaching, helping them. And it's also a great way of doing skill sharing. So somebody who's been doing has a responsibility, they can coach, mentor, share with somebody who wants to learn that skill. And then now you have cross training. You have more people who are capable of doing that work, and it becomes easier for the organization to get things done. Part of that delegation is done through domains or circles. And this is kind of the hallmark of sociocracy. And that is at a high level, we are delegating out the work of the whole organization and saying there are sub functions that it just makes sense to have some specialization there. So, for example, in the Lifeboat Academy, we've got an outreach and networking guild. We've got a heart work and philosophy guild. We've got a farm, food, and housing guild. That's a way of looking at the various responsibilities that we have as a whole organization and allowing some people who have more interest, more skill, and more time to work on those different areas. And when you're doing that, you're making sure that, again, that the domain of influence comes with the resources that are necessary to be able to get the work done. One of the things that is, in some ways, this is really no different than committees in a traditional committees or departments in a traditional structure. The thing that is unique about sociocracy is these are not silos. These are always interconnected, and they're usually interconnected in a couple different ways, by having people sit on more than one of the domains of the guild. We call them guilds, and making sure that where you identify those points of interconnection, and there is a responsibility then for cross communication between those guilds, between those domains. And this is our org chart for the Lifeboat Academy, and you can see that we've identified areas where some things have more or less overlap and interconnections between them. And I think the last thing that I want to cover is project management and tools for organizing work. And the key point that I want to make here, there's three things that I think that we've already talked about retrospectives and planning meetings. That's really part of the AMAC reflect cycle. But what they call a pool system for work, and the two in the middle here, limiting work in progress and prioritized backlogs, these are really important for most organizations. We generally take on too much. We try to do too much. And so limiting work in progress is a way of forcing yourself, your organization, to say, we can't do more than we can do. And so really picking, no more than X projects, no more than X tasks on anyone's plate at one time. And what that means is that you have to take a lot of things that are on your idealized to-do list and you put them in the backlog. And our colleague April, one of the things she says is strategy is mostly about identifying what you're not going to work on so that you have the space and energy to work on the things that actually are priorities. So being able to say no to things is an absolutely fundamental ability in the organization. And then likewise, because this is peer-to-peer, nobody is the boss, nobody can force anyone to do anything. It's all based on a pool work system, which means people self-select the task that they are going to take on. And what that means is you're going to get more engagement, you're going to get people who are more interested in the work that they're doing, and accountability becomes, reciprocity and accountability become fundamental, because you need to also have a system in place where you can make sure that that everyone's pooling a fair share of the work and that it's not falling on just a few shoulders. So I think that was a lot to cover. I know we could go into a lot of these things in a lot more detail, and if people were interested, we're more than happy to provide those opportunities as part of the Lifeboat Academy. And if you come to the orientation this Friday or next Monday, we'll talk about how you can actually do that. And but I think that the main things that I want to leave you with in terms of sociocracy is that it is fundamentally about treating everything as a series of experiments and figuring out ways of leaning into the tension, leaning into the drivers, and setting up your experiments in a way that you're learning as quickly as you can. And everything else is really just details. So that is that. And I'm going to stop screen share and just see if we have any questions or comments. Actually, Ronnie, let me throw it over to you first and just say, is there anything that you want to add to the mix? And then we'll open it up to questions.
I think it was great, and you did a great job. And I definitely encourage folks to come to different circles and other offerings that we do to actually experience how sociocracy works. And honestly, the guilds are where we really get into the nitty gritty, the processes that really make everything work so much more effectively. Shirley, did you have a question?
You're muted. You're muted, Shirley.
Sorry. Thank you, Ben. That was really clear and quite inspirational. I wish I'd known this 40 years ago. But the one concept that I don't fully understand in your language is driver.
Mm-hmm. The driver is or are the underlying forces at work or motivations at play. Let's see if we can think of some drivers. Action versus planning is a consistent pair of drivers. And usually a lot of the tensions that are going to reveal themselves in an organization are a tension between action and planning. And, oftentimes you'll get into these debates. People say, I'm just an action person. I don't want to sit around and plan. And, of course, the downside is if people are just going off and doing things, they're going to run into predictable pitfalls pretty quickly. Likewise, on the other extreme, if you sit around for 10 years developing your plan, and don't actually do anything and wait till that day when you have the perfect plan without any objections, nothing's ever going to get done. So the drivers are the kind of the forces that you need to balance as you're making choices. So the good of the individual versus the good of the group, that's another kind of perennial challenge of, you know, what's in it for the individual versus what's in it for the group. Planning short-term versus long-term. You know, are we only going to make our decisions for the next 3 months, or are we going to be looking 10 years out or 7 generations out? So the drivers are what's going on under the surface. Does that help? Does that make more sense?
It does. It does. I'm still more of a pragmatic than theoretical worker. So I have to just let it percolate for a little while.
Well, and so one of the things that we do is navigate via tensions, and that's a process from sociocracy. And what the way that'll play out, because you're talking about practicality. So practically what'll happen is somebody will say, I am sick about the kitchen is always a mess, right? You know, we agreed the kitchen's supposed to stay clean. So rather than letting that be a kind of like an argument, who's responsible for this? We sit around, we talk about, okay, so what's at play here? And it could be that, well, there's only one person who's designated to clean up and we need more than one person, or it's the cleaning is happening at the wrong time. When you give people, so you explore the tension. And in exploring the tension, people can say, I am so frustrated that blah, blah, blah. And when you allow people, when it goes around several times, you start to recognize, oh, underneath that complaint, there are these things that are going on. Like, for example, maybe we need another person to be scheduled for kitchen duty, you know, or maybe we need more time when that's going to happen, that, you know, people are kept out of the kitchen. So it is very practical, but it's allowing people to voice the tension, but then not to get stuck on the tension, but to look underneath it to what's kind of the preconditions, or the, you know, the things that you can actually take action on. Did that help? Ronnie, do you have anything?
That was more helpful. It's
Cool.
simple-minded words for simple minds.
Well, and this is what I like about sociocracy, is it really is ultimately, this is about getting shit done. And the tools they sound very kind of esoteric, but like Ronnie was saying, if you come to our meetings and you see about how it works, it's very practical. Are there any other questions or comments?
We just wanted to comment and say we've been listening in, and we really appreciate this framework, and it seems to be really useful in terms of ensuring that everybody gets heard and everyone has a vested interest in each other and each other's satisfaction, while also understanding that the tensions are something to be examined and understood and like worked around, and not something to be just avoided, which we've seen can be really common in organizations, particularly that are grounded in like very Western cultural values. So think it's dope. Thank you for having us. Thank you for sharing this. Yeah, we look forward to putting some of this to work in some of our organizations. And a big thank you to Austin for inviting us. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being here. And if you have any questions, you know, we'd love to geek out on sociocracy. So keep the lines of communication open.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Ben. Bye. Bye, Ronnie. Bye, Austin.
Bye. Thanks for being here. Thanks,
night.
everyone.
Thanks for being
Take
here.
care.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, yeah.